Howdy and good morning, friends and faithful listeners. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend, and I'm so thankful that you're here to share a delicious cup of coffee with me as we read the Bible together. Today we are in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 7, and we're going to be talking about this big party that Solomon throws for the people after the dedication of the temple, and also God's presence coming down and lighting the altar with his fire. It's going to be a great episode, so stay tuned. So as you guys know, on Mondays and Wednesdays, I talk about the Old Testament, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays, I discuss the New Testament. And I am so happy to announce that tomorrow we are going to be starting the book of 1 Timothy. And the reason I'm so excited about it is because the books of 1 and 2 Timothy are some of my favorites in the New Testament. And I know I say that about every book of the Bible. Every single one of them is my favorite, but I'm telling you guys, 1 and 2 Timothy are some of my favorite books in the New Testament. So make sure to tune in. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you guys are as well. But for today, let's go ahead and read 2 Chronicles 7, 1 through 11. And I'll be reading, as always, from the WEB, and we'll be covering a few topics today, mainly God's fire coming down out of heaven. What was that about? And also, why does God command the people for the fire to never go out on the altar? How is that possible? And lastly, is it okay for Christians to have fun and to party? We'll get into all of that today. So let's read 2 Chronicles 7, 1 through 11. I'll be reading from the WEB. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and Yahweh's glory filled the house. The priests could not enter into Yahweh's house because Yahweh's glory filled Yahweh's house. All the children of Israel looked on when the fire came down and Yahweh's glory was on the house. They bowed themselves with their faces to the ground on the pavement, worshipped, and gave thanks to Yahweh, saying, "For he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever." Then the king and all the people offered sacrifices before Yahweh. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people dedicated God's house. The priests stood, according to their positions, the Levites also with instruments of music to Yahweh, which David the king had made to give thanks to Yahweh, when David praised by their ministry, saying, "For his loving kindness endures forever." The priests sounded trumpets before them, and all Israel stood. Moreover, Solomon made the middle of the court that was before Yahweh's house holy. For there he offered the burnt offerings and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar which Solomon had made was not able to receive the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the fat. So Solomon held the feast at that time for 7 days. And all Israel was with him, a very great assembly, from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. On the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. On the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their tents, joyful and glad of heart, for the goodness that Yahweh had shown to David, to Solomon, and to Israel his people. Thus Solomon finished Yahweh's house and the king's house, and he successfully completed all that came into Solomon's heart to make in Yahweh's house and in his own house. We finished talking about the dedication prayer that Solomon gave last week, and it was a very long prayer. It was a very beautiful prayer. We had to break it up into 2 sections, but essentially Solomon gave thanks that God had blessed Israel. He gave thanks that God had blessed Solomon himself, and then he also asked God to bless the people in the future, specifically with forgiveness. Solomon was like, when the people sin, and when they are carried away to foreign lands because of their sin, please, God, hear from heaven when they change their minds and come to their senses. And that was essentially the entire prayer. And so now the dedication of the temple is over, and God himself, who has already accepted the temple, because don't forget, before Solomon gave that prayer, God actually came down and filled the temple with the cloud of his glory. So much so that the priests couldn't even enter the temple because of how thick the cloud was. God's glory was just too great. And that was when Solomon gave the prayer in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. And now Solomon finishes the prayer. And here's what it says in verse 1. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and Yahweh's glory filled the house. The priests could not enter into Yahweh's house because Yahweh's glory filled Yahweh's house. Now you might be like, man, that sounds a lot like what happened in 2 Chronicles 5. Like right before Solomon gave the prayer, it says something very similar, that God's glory filled the house and the priests couldn't enter because of God's glory. So is this the same thing? No, I don't think it's the same thing, because let's go back and read 2 Chronicles 5 and talk about God's glory first filling the temple. 2 Chronicles 5, 12 through 14 says this: "The Levites who are singers, all of them, even Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, and their sons and their brothers, arrayed in fine linen, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps, stood at the east end of the altar, and with them 120 priests sounding the trumpets. When the trumpeters and the singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking Yahweh, and when they lifted up their voice with the trumpets and the cymbals and the instruments of music, and praised Yahweh, saying, 'For he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever,' then the house was filled with a cloud, even Yahweh's house, so that the priests could not stand to minister by reason for the cloud." So as you can see, that's a little bit different than our passage for today. It mentions the cloud filling the house, and this cloud was so glory filled that the priests couldn't even go into the temple. But in 2 Chronicles 7, it mentions the fire that came down, not the cloud. So let's read this again. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 1. "When Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and Yahweh's glory filled the house." So there you can see, it was not a cloud this time. It was actually fire coming down from heaven. And this is really cool because there's two things we associate with God's presence. The first being the cloud, and the second thing being fire. Especially if you're reading through the early Old Testament, like in the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll see God show up a lot in the form of either a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire. So God now shows up as a pillar of fire to his people. The fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and Yahweh's glory filled the house, so that the priests could not enter into Yahweh's house because Yahweh's glory filled the house. And all the children of Israel looked on, and when the fire came down and Yahweh's glory was on the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground on the pavement, worshipped, and gave thanks to Yahweh, saying, "For he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever." Can you imagine being one of the people that sees fire come down out of heaven and consume the burnt offering? Can you imagine that? Like, how could you not have faith in God after seeing something so amazing like that? And that's what the people were able to see. They saw God's presence consume the burnt offering and fill the temple even more with his glory. His glory was already in the temple in the form of the cloud, but now it shows up even more so that the people can't help but worship God. But what's really funny about this is if you go to Leviticus chapter 9, 23 and 24, God does pretty much the exact same thing back in the wilderness days. When the tent of meeting was first made and dedicated, God also, in the form of fire, came down and consumed the burnt offering. But the people have a very, very different response to God's presence in Leviticus than they did in our passage for today. So let's read Leviticus 9, 23 and 24 and see how the people respond. "Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting and came out and blessed the people, and Yahweh's glory appeared to all the people. Fire came out from before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the fat upon the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces." So that's a very different response than what the people in 2 Chronicles were doing. The people in the wilderness were so freaked out by God's presence that they shouted, like they screamed when they saw God consume the burnt offering. And they fell on their faces as if they were dead. Whereas the people in 2 Chronicles 7, yes, they fell on their faces, But they did it in worship, and there was no screaming for their lives that we know of. Instead, they were giving thanks to Yahweh and worshiping, and they were singing, for he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever. So a very, very different response from the people in 2 Chronicles 7 as compared to the people in the wilderness. And that just goes to show like how against God the wilderness people truly were, that like every single time he showed up, they were freaked out and couldn't handle it. They like didn't want his presence, is kind of what it seems like. But now, thankfully, through the leadership of David and Solomon being Yahweh worshipers, so excited about the dedication of the brand new temple to God, the people have courage and faith that when they see God show up in the form of fire, they are able to worship rather than screaming and falling over like dead. But why did God show up in this way? Like, why is it that whenever a new temple or tent of meeting is dedicated, God shoots fire out of heaven and burns up the sacrifice on the altar? Like, why is that God's chosen method? Well, because of what Leviticus chapter 6 says. This was a law that God gave to the people. Leviticus 6, 8 through 13. Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth of the altar all night until the morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. The priest shall put on his linen garment, and shall put on his linen trousers upon his body, and shall remove the ashes from where the fire has consumed the burnt offering on the altar, and shall put them beside the altar. He shall take off his garments and put on other garments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not go out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning. He shall lay the burnt offering in order upon it, and shall burn it on the fat of the peace offerings. Fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually. It shall not go out." So what's the one theme you noticed in all of those verses? That the fire should not go out. It needed to keep burning continually on the altar. And why is that? Well, because God himself lit it. God did not want the priests lighting a new fire every single day, because first and foremost, that actually does take a long time to do. Like, if you guys have ever tried to light a fire, sometimes it is like stubborn, and it's really, really hard to light something on fire. Like, those things when you were a kid, how they always told you like stop, drop, and roll, and you thought that, catching fire was so easy. It is not easy. Like, I have dried leaves in my backyard and I can't even catch them on fire. Starting a fire every single morning would be very difficult. So it's easier actually on the priests to keep this fire lit all the time. Now, this of course means that there'd have to be priests working around the clock to make sure that fire never went out. But that wasn't a problem in the days of Solomon because of how many priests there actually were. Like, it was doable to have priests working around the clock. There were so many priests. In fact, they would take turns and take breaks and things. But anyway, the altar was always supposed to be lit with the fire of God. And why is that? It wasn't just because it's easier to keep a fire going, but it was also because this fire was special. This was God's fire from his own glory. So you can imagine, the people who see this happening at the dedication of the temple, they can tell their grandchildren 70 years later, hey, when I was a little kid, your age, I saw that fire get lit. And then that little kid can grow up and tell his kids about it. And the people of Israel would know that was God's fire. There was something special about that. God himself had actually been among his people and was still with them in that glorious fire. So that's the main reason why the fire was never supposed to go out, because it was a special fire and a testament to who God really was. And actually, the priests were successful, that we know of, in keeping this fire lit the entire time. It was lit until the Babylonian captivity, actually. And we know the Babylonians came in, they destroyed the temple, and at that point, the fire went out. But after all that happened, they say the fire miraculously came back in the time of the Maccabees, when the temple had been rebuilt, and the Maccabees were protecting it from the Greeks who came in trying to destroy it. So that fire was special, and it was never supposed to go out because it was a testament to who God really was. So after the people see this miraculous sign from heaven, they of course can't help but worship. And they're singing to God. They're singing, "For he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever." Now, this was a little ditty that David had made. In fact, you'll see through the Psalms that this was a very common phrase that David used in a lot of different Psalms. So it was a common thing for the people to sing. And actually, it even says that in this passage. It mentions that David praised God by saying, "His loving kindness endures forever." That's in verse 6. We'll get to that in a second. But in verse 4, the king and all the people offered sacrifices before Yahweh. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people dedicated God's house. So something I didn't realize earlier when I talked about all of the crazy amounts of sacrifices that Solomon did in dedication of the temple, I didn't realize until today that he had done 2 separate sacrifices. I kind of thought it was just one. And we went into that. We talked about how, God does not desire sacrifice. Like, it was necessary at this time because that was how people had their sins forgiven. But God didn't desire it because animal sacrifice was just a problem of sin, technically. And also, the animals themselves, God loves animals and cares about their lives. So God does not desire animal sacrifices, but they were necessary to be done. But in the case of right here, where Solomon's offering a sacrifice of 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep, most people think he wasn't doing that sacrifice for himself, but actually for the people. Now, these were peace offerings that we find out in 1 Kings 8. And when it came to peace offerings, part of the sacrifice went back to the people. So some of that meat actually went home with the individual. That wasn't the case for every sacrifice. A lot of times a sacrifice was a sacrifice. You gave the entire animal to God. But in the case of peace offerings, the meat was given back to the people, and only part of the animal was given to God. So it could be that Solomon, in planning this big party that he had, actually dedicated a lot of this meat to the people and gave it to them as a free gift of celebration for the dedication of the temple. So the priests stood according to their positions, and the Levites also with instruments of music to Yahweh, which David the king had made to give thanks to Yahweh when David praised by their ministry, saying, "For his loving kindness endures forever." The priests sounded trumpets before them, and all Israel stood. Moreover, Solomon made the middle of the court that was before Yahweh's house holy, for there he offered the burnt offerings and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar which Solomon had made was not able to receive the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the fat. So we talked about that the other day, where there were so many sacrifices coming into the temple that the big altar, like the giant bronze altar that Solomon had made, was not big enough. So Solomon had to put smaller altars all over the place. Well, he dedicated one of them as holy, the one specifically in the middle of the court. And once again, all the burnt offerings that Solomon was sacrificing to God and giving to the people, there was too many to actually put them on the big altar, and they had to go on a different altar. So Solomon held a feast at that time for 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. So the people celebrated with God. And I don't know if God's presence remained in the temple the entire time. He very well could have. But regardless, the people celebrated all over Israel, from the border of Egypt all the way to the north. Everyone was so excited about the temple finally being built that they probably took some time off work and had a big party and celebration with all their friends and family members. Then on the 8th day, in verse 9, they held a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days and the feast 7 days. So it wasn't just partying and celebration. There was also essentially church services happening as well. That would be the solemn assembly, where the people go to the temple and they're not partying. They're learning about Yahweh. They're having the scrolls of the law read to them. They're listening to worship music. They're probably partaking in worship in whatever that looked like these days. That would be the solemn assembly. And I wouldn't be myself if I didn't throw some shade on our modern day churches. So that's what I'm going to do right now. But I think sometimes Christians or churches don't understand the mixture of reverence and fun. Sometimes churches are overly solemn, where they're like, we can't have any fun whatsoever. In fact, we had a problem with that not too long ago in my church with the youth group. As you guys know, I'm one of the youth leaders at my church. And somebody was really upset that the teenagers play games and have fun at youth group. They kind of thought that it should just be sitting down and doing a Bible study the entire time. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. There's certainly a time and place for a Bible study and for a solemn assembly. But we can also have fun. It's not wrong for teenagers to play games at youth group. But then on the flip side, there's some churches that are way too into fun and don't do the solemn assembly, don't have any reverence whatsoever. They're only focused on the entertainment aspect. They're only focused on how many people they can get through the door and how much fun people are having. That's wrong too. There should be a mixture of the two. Christians can have fun, but there also needs to be reverence and a solemn assembly. So after all this happens, in verse 10, it says, on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their tents, joyful and glad of heart for the goodness that Yahweh had shown to David, to Solomon, and to Israel, his people. Thus Solomon finished Yahweh's house and the king's house, and he successfully completed all that came into Solomon's heart to make in Yahweh's house and his own house. So Solomon finished everything, not just Yahweh's house, but also his own home as well. And we do know from 1 Kings that Solomon took more time to build his own house. But, I don't necessarily know if that was a bad thing. It could have been if Solomon was putting more time and attention into his house as compared to the temple. But probably the reason the temple went faster, quite honestly, is for two reasons. Firstly, it was more important. The temple was where the people were going to come and worship. And so maybe Solomon prioritized the temple to get done faster just because of that fact. And also, the temple plans were done way ahead of time. And Solomon had already acquired everything he needed to actually build the temple way ahead of time. Whereas that wasn't the same case with his own house. So even though, yes, Solomon took more time to build his own house, I don't know for sure, but I would guess it was not done with a wrong heart. But anyway, we're going to talk about Solomon being visited by God in the night. God is going to talk to Solomon once again. We know that God did appear to Solomon, actually a few years before this, but now God appears to him again. So we're going to talk about that on Wednesday. I hope you tune in for that episode. So faithful listeners, please check out all the links listed in the description of this episode and click on them if you want to know more about P40 Ministries or the Bible Explained podcast, or if you'd like to support the Bible Explained by purchasing something from the shop, maybe getting the Adore Advent devotional because Advent is coming up, or some merch from the merch shop like the really cozy P40 Ministries beanies that I have available. You should check all of those links out. But of course, please pray for this ministry, that it gets spread to more people, that the Bible gets spread to more people. And another excellent way to do that is by just rating this podcast on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that you listen, and also sharing the podcast with your friends and family. Faithful listeners, I will see you guys tomorrow as we start a new book of the New Testament, 1 Timothy. So make sure to tune in 6 a.m. or actually whenever you wake up and listen for an episode from 1 Timothy. Until tomorrow, happy listening and God bless.